Scholars have long argued over what the seven wonders of the world really looked like. The Great Pyramid still stands, much as it did 3,500 years ago. But the stories are so fantastic and the evidence so scarce that academics have even questioned whether some of the others existed at all. Our investigators have the task of separating myth from reality. Mark Telesnik is a geotechnical engineer from the Israel Institute of Technology.
I had no idea that we were going to see so much physical evidence left over.
Dr. Peter Brand is a historian at the University of Memphis. His area of expertise is ancient Egypt.
What's interesting to me is trying to get to the bottom of the facts about these marvelous structures. There must have been real wonders. These weren't just invented out of people's imaginations.
Tessa Dunlop is a classicist trained at Oxford University. She begins the investigation in London with the very idea of selecting seven wonders. Where did the list come from?
What I find fascinating about the Seven Wonders is that they didn't just come from nowhere. Considerable thought was given to what went on the list. And I want to find out who it was that decided what went on the list and why those seven in particular.
At the British Museum, the world's largest collection of artifacts from the classical age, Tessa is joined by historian Dr. Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. Lloyd traces the origins of the list to ancient Greece.
So what exactly makes a wonder? What's the definition?
That's a good question, because the Greeks themselves, wouldn't really have used the word wonder. When these lists were originally put together, the Greeks used the word theaton, so which means sort of to see, a sight worth visiting, that kind of thing. When the list progressed in later centuries, so they changed that word to thauma, which means a wonder.
But this was more than a list of tourist attractions. It was drawn up at a time when Greek culture dominated the ancient world. Alexander the Great had led the most fearsome military force in history to conquer lands from India to Egypt. The Greeks believed that they were spearheading a new era of achievement where mankind reached new heights. They set about cataloging the greatest monuments that stood within their boundaries.
So with all these incredible man-made wonders, why seven, and why in particular these seven?
We know that Babylonian mathematicians and astrologers were very keen on the number seven. So in a way, seven is the ultimate number. So I suppose it encompasses everything, the concept of completeness.
Although ancient authors such as Herodotus wrote about the sites they considered important, the first listing of seven definitive landmarks wasn't until the 2nd century BC. And this list, by Antipater of Sidon, throws up a surprise.
Here he talks about the fact that he has set his eyes on the lofty walls of Babylon, which is wide enough for chariots, a statue of Zeus. Then he talks about the Colossus of the Sun and the Hanging Gardens. He talks about the huge labor of the pyramids and then the vast tomb of Mausolus. But he says that the greatest of all of these is the house of Artemis.
This isn't the same list as the one we know today. The Pharos, the lighthouse at Alexandria, isn't mentioned. The earliest reference to it comes from the 6th century AD. And the agreed list of ancient wonders that we have is perhaps less than 500 years old.
The canon that we know today really comes down to us because of the influence that we had in the Renaissance period, from the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, when artists, particularly German and Dutch artists, were recreating visual representations of what they thought the seven wonders of the world looked like. And this is the canon that we accept today.
Images like these engravings by Martin van Heemskerk rekindled a fascination with the seven wonders. They kept the idea alive in people's imaginations. But by the time they were made, some of the actual structures had been lost for 1,000 years. And our investigators need archaeological evidence that relates directly to the buildings themselves. Now, the hunt for physical clues will begin in Alexandria with Peter Brand.
Everything we know physically about the Pharos warrants its position as a wonder of the world.
Peter's come to Alexandria, 140 miles north of Cairo. It's been Egypt's busiest port for more than 2,000 years, ever since Alexander the Great came here. He founded the city that would bear his name in 331 BC.
I'm here in a busy marketplace in modern Alexandria, which is appropriate since ancient Alexandria was the commercial center of the Mediterranean world.
The city became one of the greatest in antiquity and an outpost of Greek culture in the heart of Egypt. It was a magnet for intellectuals as well as traders. The library that attracted them, like most of Alexander's city, is long gone, and little is left of the pharaohs but legends. Martin van Heemskerk's engraving depicts an almost magical building, a structure wrapped in a spiral ramp reaching up to the clouds.
We have many tall tales about the lighthouse. Supposedly it could be seen from 300 miles away. But what I want to discover is, what did the lighthouse actually look like?
But there are more credible accounts. The Greek historian Strabo wrote, "A rock has upon it a tower that is admirably constructed of white marble with many stories." Representations of the pharaohs as a simple tower occur on ancient coins found in the city. And now, Peter is traveling 50 miles along the coast from Alexandria to examine a structure that appears to match both the coins and the ancient descriptions. This monument was built to honor an Egyptian dignitary at a time when the pharaohs were said to be still standing. The likeness to the coins is uncanny.
It matches in a very reasonable and believable way the descriptions that we have. You have a square base, a middle section, which is slightly smaller, that is octagonal in shape, and finally, smaller still, a round cylindrical tower at the top.
Its highly unusual shape and the fact that it matches the ancient descriptions and images point to the conclusion that this building is itself a miniature version of the pharaohs.
It makes perfect sense for somebody, some ambitious individual at some point, deciding they were going to make their own mini lighthouse, this wondrous local landmark.
Alexandria was growing rapidly as a port when the pharaohs was first conceived. Strabo wrote that it was built to guide mariners to the safety of the city's harbors, avoiding treacherous rocks. Perhaps the pharaohs was intended not merely to warn, but welcome, a navigation point to tell ships they had reached their destination. But what was its exact location? Strabo says its name comes from where it stood, on the island of Pharos. The problem is that no such island exists today. Peter meets up with archaeologist Colin Clements, who has spent the past decade hunting for the Pharos' ruins. He explains that the coastline here has changed dramatically over the centuries.
There was no land here. If you take a line from perhaps those two minarets and then just sweep away all the construction down to perhaps that modern square black tower there was no land. All there was a causeway which linked the continent to the island of Pharos.
In the 3rd and 4th centuries BC, a few hundred yards of water separated this small landmass from the mainland. It was reached by a causeway, a man-made stone path which split the city's natural harbor in two. Over hundreds of years, a natural buildup of silt pushed the coastline back. Buildings now cover this new land. It's made pinning down the exact location of the lighthouse extremely difficult. To narrow his search, Colin began with a local legend that says that this fortress was built on the Pharos' ruins. His team started diving here, and they struck gold.
The research that we've been doing has been showing where we've been diving, the concentration of architectural elements, ancient architectural elements that we've been looking at is in the water just off here. Over an area of about 1.3 hectares, we've to date registered some 3,000 architectural elements. There are more there.
Remains lie scattered across 3 acres of seabed. Some are so large they could only have come from an immense structure. Colin believes they belong to the pharaohs.
We have found certain blocks of such size that they have to come from a monument of huge size. And I'm talking blocks of granite which are 11 meters long, which weigh 70 tons.
The size of these blocks certainly indicates that they come from a monumental structure. Their location tallies with the ancient accounts. And their architectural style indicates that they come from the time of the pharaohs. Seeing for himself some of the blocks that have been raised from the seabed, Peter is convinced.
This is amazing. We actually have a piece of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, part of the lighthouse of Alexandria.
Absolutely. This is part of the doorway. This is one of the uprights, one of the door jambs of what would have been a monumental entrance facing to the sea. And we have other elements of it. We have the other jamb still underwater. We've got the lintel in fragments underwater as well, but it fits together.
So how big exactly would this doorway have been?
When it was upright, the two jambs with the lintel, we're calculating the door was over 40 feet high, about 10 foot in depth, and about 15 foot wide, the actual entranceway. So it's a monumental doorway, yes.
One final mystery remains. Our word lighthouse implies that the pharaohs was topped with some kind of beacon. Did a fire really burn at the top of this 300-foot tower?
It's hard to imagine if there was a fire what would be being burnt. Egypt is a land essentially without trees. What are you going to be burning? It would be very expensive to keep it going.
But experts are divided. It's said the pharaoh stood for 1,600 years. Over that time, it was adapted and improved. Though no hard evidence has been found, it's quite possible that it did once bear a flame.
Even if there was no light at the top, it would have shone in the sun and therefore would have been a beacon just because of the material that the building was made of.
And now we can recreate the pharaohs. At its base stood an imposing doorway and majestic sculptures, carved of red Aswan granite. Clad in white limestone, it stood as tall as the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This was not just an ordinary lighthouse, but a site that drew thousands to one of the most important cities in the world. At the city of Ephesus, 500 miles northwest across the sea, stood a building which would attract people in even greater numbers. It was the most visited shrine in the ancient world, the home of Artemis, goddess of fertility. It stood in the ancient Turkish town of Ephesus, on a fault line. This is a place where earthquakes are still common. And the Temple of Artemis has lain ruined here for more than 16 centuries. Artemis, worshipped by the Romans as Diana, was the most revered and adored of all female deities. She was the huntress, the goddess of the moon, of chastity and childbirth. She was the bringer of fertility. The shrine here was built by her devotees. It's said to have been the largest in the ancient world. Again, the most famous image of the temple makes no claim to be factually accurate.
The best-known image we have of the temple is this Heemskerk drawing from the Renaissance period. And he was a man who very much allowed the present to influence his interpretation of the past. So what we've actually got is a picture of a sort of squat-looking Italian church. Now, I want to know if this actually represents the temple in any way, or if, in fact, it was infinitely more superior.
Tessa Dunlop meets archaeologist Julian Bennett. He spent years exploring both the ruins of the temple and the town that grew up around it.
What relation does Ephesus have with the Temple of Artemis itself?
Very closely connected. The shrine of Artemis was probably established a long, long time before there was any real settlement here. But over time, the shrine attracted people, the temple attracted people, so you get the settlement developing here as well.
For centuries before the temple was built, a simple shrine stood on the site. People came throughout the year to offer prayers to the goddess. As the cult of Artemis grew, so did the town. Pilgrims meant prosperity. Ephesus became important because of Artemis. This was a boom town, thriving on religion. And in around 550 BC, the king Croesus financed construction of a new temple. It was destined to be one of the seven ancient wonders.
So these rocks, are these all from the original temple that we're seeing along here?
They are indeed.
And this is where it would have been, yes?
This is precisely where the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was.
The Roman historian Pliny gives the building's dimensions. He says it consisted of a raised marble platform, 140 yards by 80. On top of it, fluted columns thrust 60 feet in the air and held the roof structure in place. Tessa and Julian pace out the site. They find it's a description that matches the evidence on the ground. This was the first temple to be constructed entirely of marble, and experts have estimated the amount needed, around 51,000 tons. When the question arose of where all this stone came from, they found a clue in local folklore. Legend has it that a goat herd discovered marble deposits when one of his goats kicked away a loose piece of rock. Seeing the gleaming stone beneath, he ran 8 miles to Ephesus to tell what he'd found. 2,500 years later, archaeologists searched on a radius 8 miles from the temple site and found the quarry again.
So in other words, the marble from this quarry was used to build the temple.
Absolutely.
How can you be so sure?
Well, this is the only white marble quarry 8 miles from Ephesus. The other way is through chemical analysis. We can actually analyze marble and tell where it comes from.
Once the stones were on site, the building could begin.
But if you look in this area here, the foundations of part of the temple, it was one of the 7 wonders.
I'm sitting on those foundations.
This is it, made of this nice white marble.
From what I can see, this is a clean line. There's actually no mortar there, is there?
All this is dry stone built.
And yet this was an earthquake zone. There was the constant threat that the land would be rocked by tremors.
So what kept it all together?
Gravity and weight for the foundations, essentially. But for the walls, these were held together by a series of clamps. And the same with the columns. These would have had a central clamp to hold the structure together.
So you're telling me that a simple little wooden clamp kept a massive, great temple together?
This is what we have here. The clamp hole, shaped like a swallow's tail on both sides. There would have been a piece of wood, or possibly, depending on what the workmen here used, a piece of metal, but in the earliest temples, always made of wood.
A shrine had stood on this site for centuries. It was sacred ground. The temple could be built nowhere else. But the architects faced a massive problem. The land was a marsh. Somehow, they needed to create foundations stable enough to support such a structure.
According to our sources, when it was built, they established a platform of charcoal and sheep's fleeces to help stabilize the soil.
This solution, a foundation beneath the foundation, spread the structure's weight and stopped sinking. It enabled the construction of an extraordinary building, 127 columns towering upwards. Sunlight poured through an open roof, shining on the temple's centerpiece, the statue of the goddess, Artemis. This original temple stood for more than 200 years before it was destroyed by fire in 323 BC. Rebuilt, it stood for another 6 centuries until an earthquake did finally bring it down. The stones were plundered for use in other buildings. The walls of this 14th century mosque hold pieces of the Temple of Artemis.
A lot of the temple was removed and reused in other buildings, and you can recognize the type of marble and limestone here.
The whirly bits?
This is another piece from the, probably from the Great Altar, but certainly from the Temple of Artemis.
By modern standards, this was a vast building. To a pilgrim 2,500 years ago, its scale, the sheer quantity of stone involved, must have defied belief. One of the earliest known lists of the 7 wonders of the world was drawn up around the 3rd century BC by the Greek historian Antipater of Sidon. By the time it was written, one building on that list was already a legend and already 2,000 years old. The Great Pyramid of Giza lies on the edge of Cairo, the capital of Egypt. It occupies a rocky plain known as the Giza Plateau. It stands alongside 2 other pyramids. But the Great Pyramid is the biggest of the 3, built for the pharaoh Khufu. Its purpose was to give him safe passage into the next world. Historian Peter Brand wants to know how it was built.
on the outskirts of modern Cairo to visit the one surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Many people imagine there are still mysteries surrounding this marvelous structure. For instance, how was it built? But I think the clues are there for us to understand exactly how the ancient builders achieved this wonderful structure.
Its 20-year construction required almost 2.5 million blocks, each weighing around 2.5 tons. Over 20 years, that means the positioning of a new block every 2 minutes. There are 203 courses of stones. Each side of the pyramid measures 755 feet, accurate to within just a few inches. And each corner is aligned with the points of the compass.
What I want to know is, how did they find due north?
Well, Peter, with the help of these two tools here. These have been seen in tomb representations, and we also have models of them, and these are replicas.
These simple tools are called the bay and the merket. They were used to mark points at which a star rose and set around the North Star. From this, an angle could be marked, and a line through the middle of this angle gave due north.
So what we're going to end up with is a perfectly straight line that runs exactly due north-south. So we'll have one side of our pyramid. But what I want to know is, how do you turn that straight line into a square base to build your pyramid on?
The process of plotting a square starts with marking out the north-south line.
Right, we'll put this stone down here.
Okay, so we've established that this is perfectly north-south, and then the next thing we have to do is take another...
You need another line for the east-west direction. You take it that way. I'll put my block here. Right, put yours down a minute. That's good. Yeah.
But how are we going to make sure that this is exactly at right angles, that this is due east-west?
Well, by the use of this tool. It's a simple set square. The Egyptians definitely had them because we have models of them. And we can use the set square in this way. We can place it along the north-south line, and then we can use the second line to establish the east-west direction.
By moving the second line until it aligns with the set square, a true east-west bearing can be marked.
That's it. Bit more, bit more, bit more. Stop.
The length of the side is accurately measured. Then the process is repeated at the next corner. Once all 4 corners are marked, the process is repeated to eliminate errors. Eventually, a near-perfect square can be constructed. Although it required enormous skill, this was the easy stage of construction. The next phase was the cutting, shaping, and lifting of nearly 6 million tons of stone. Traces of a quarry can be found in the shadow of the pyramid. On the walls, ancient chisel marks show where the stone was cut by hand.
We've got 3 rods here, and the 2 outer ones are joined by a taut string. The third one, which is the same length as the other 2, can be used now to check if the surface all the way along under the string is truly level. Well, it is there, so should we move it just a little bit further over there? And let's check this side. Oh, yes, very nice.
Despite its simplicity, it's a hugely accurate tool. And there were other measuring devices used once the stones were in place on the pyramid. It wasn't enough to know a surface was flat. It had to be at a perfect right angle to every other surface. Place this F-frame against a vertical edge. If the string hangs against the bottom bar, the edge is true. And this A-frame, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a spirit level, tells you if a stone is horizontal.
Let's look at our level and see if it's true, and it looks to me that it is. Now, presumably, if this was off, we'd get something like this.
That's right. You would see the line clearly visible, and you would know that it was not truly horizontal.
The pyramid's biggest mystery has always been how the blocks were brought from the quarry to the site. They couldn't be rolled. The blocks would be damaged. Egyptologists have discovered evidence to show how it might have been done. This sledge could carry a stone weighing over 2 tons.
About 6 strong men would be needed to pull it on a level surface.
But as the pyramid grew, so the stones had to be transported higher and higher. It's believed ramps were used, but if they were too steep, it would have been impossible to pull the sledge.
The ramps couldn't be more than 7 degrees slope. There's good evidence for this because my experiments have shown that if it is more than 7 degrees, the sledge will slip backwards on its own.
If the incline could only be 7 degrees, as the pyramid got higher, the ramp would have to get longer. Eventually, it would have to be so long that it would overshoot the quarry. But there is an alternative theory. A girdle ramp, so called because it wraps itself around the pyramid. Maneuvering massive stones around the 4 corners would have been difficult. But Dennis believes he knows how ramps were used, by combining both a straight and a girdle ramp.
I think that it's a solution of the ramp being straight part of the way up, because about 2/3 the way up, a lot of blocks have to be hauled up. But after that, the top third, there are very, very much lower number of blocks to be hauled up. And that means that they may then have had a wrapped around ramp for that final 1/3.
This method of constructing the pyramids has only ever been a theory until now. Archaeologists have recently unearthed the ramp on the Giza Plateau, just yards from the Great Pyramid.
So this is amazing that it survived here.
Oh, it is, yes. And of course, this wall retains all the rubble and everything else that's put into the ramp.
So it must have been made of loose rubble, and then they built this mud brick wall to hold in the debris.
Yes.
It enabled the construction of the Great Pyramid in just 20 years. And when it was finished, it looked very different from the monument we know today. It was encased in smooth limestone, long since plundered and used in buildings across Cairo. We get a hint of how it would have appeared from the few remaining limestone blocks around the pinnacle of this nearby, smaller pyramid. And we can now reveal the Great Pyramid as it stood, complete, some 4,500 years ago. 480 feet high and covering an area of more than 13 acres.
What makes this one of the true wonders of the world is not how mysterious or even advanced the technology was that built this, but how ingenious it was. Some of the tools we saw were the most simple imaginable, and yet they were able to produce such amazing, precise, astounding results.
Had the Great Pyramid been destroyed, it might be hard to believe the 7 wonders ever existed, especially as for one of them, no evidence has ever been found. A sumptuous garden in the middle of the desert. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Less is known about them than any of the other wonders. Experts are even divided as to whether they really existed.
Of all the 7 wonders, I actually think that the Hanging Gardens are the trickiest because there's much less to go on. So I want to find out, what archaeological evidence is there? What documents are there? And also, what do we in fact mean by the word hanging? And if these gardens were elevated, then how on earth were they actually watered?
Babylon was said to be the most spectacular city on earth. Today, its ruins can be found in Iraq's Babil province, 50 miles southwest of war-torn Baghdad. For many years, archaeologists have scoured the land here to find proof that the Hanging Gardens were real. They've made some amazing discoveries. City walls, palaces, and temples, but no sign of a grand garden. Much of what has been found was built by a Babylonian king mentioned in the Old Testament. King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled around 650 BC. We know this because he kept detailed records of what he built in cuneiform script on tablets, cylinders, even bricks. But is there any mention of the Hanging Gardens? Tessa meets up with Babylonian expert Professor Irving Finkel at the British Museum.
Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt the city from top to bottom, so no expense was spared, and he made sure there was a very detailed record, so everything was written down that he accomplished, boastfully and in detail. And nowhere in any of these lines of cuneiform inscription does it say anything about the garden at all.
So with no archaeological evidence for the gardens, and no account of them by the king, why does the idea persist that they were real? The only solid information we have to go on is from the Greek historians. Antipater, writing in the 3rd century BC, mentions them as the Strabo.
I think the testimony of the Greeks has to be taken seriously. After all the other wonders did exist. We know that, some of them still do. So something must have existed in Babylon to start the story off.
So this is the Greeks writing in a later period, after the Hanging Gardens and Nebuchadnezzar have passed away, as it were?
Yes, but some of those Greeks, we have to take what they say very seriously, because they were in the truth business.
But if the gardens did exist, why didn't Nebuchadnezzar mention them?
We know from the Greeks that he married a girl called Amyatis, who was a princess from Media in Iran, from a mountainous country, and the story is that she got homesick and hated the view out of her window, which was flat and boring, and that Nebuchadnezzar built these gardens to keep her happy. Now, that seems to me, although it's quite romantic, also plausible in a way, if you imagine him with all these building plans saying to the engineers, when you've got time, put something up there which is like a mountainous garden, keep the wife happy, kind of stuff. So they did, and if you went down the Euphrates River on a boat as a tourist, or you were a visitor and you saw this thing, it might make a big impact on you, because gardens are not normally up there, they're usually down there, and they would think it was something miraculous. I think we have to assume they were real. I think Nebuchadnezzar did build something.
To find out exactly what Nebuchadnezzar might have built, Tessa travels to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany, where one of the biggest collections of Babylonian artifacts can be found. Here, she enlists the help of Persian expert Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones.
There you go.
And the first thing Lloyd shows Tessa is the first thing any visitor to Babylon would have seen: the Ishtar Gate.
So this would have been one of the entrances into the ancient city of Babylon.
That's absolutely right. Today we call it the Ishtar Gate, but in antiquity it was actually called the Gate of Ishtar, who vanquishes her enemies, because this is one of the major portals into the city centre itself. And this stood at the north end of the city, and this great archway here was backed by great cedar doors which would have opened along a processional way which led you into the heart of the city, past the palaces, past the ziggurats or temples.
The size and the beauty is just, I mean, quite mind-boggling. How on earth did they do it?
Absolutely, it truly is monumental, isn't it?
Some experts believe the Ishtar Gate stood right by the gardens, and yet it's the garden, not the gate, that makes the list of 7 wonders. So we can only assume that they were more extraordinary. The colors and shapes on the gate were only possible using fired glazed bricks. Hugely expensive and difficult to make, it's no surprise then that behind this facade, making up the bulk of the structure, is a very different type of brick: sun-dried mud bricks. Archaeology suggests that much of Babylon was built of these basic bricks. But although they were cheap and easy to make in the Babylonian heat, they weren't ideal for use in a garden. And something found in the basement of the Pergamon Museum in Berlin reveals how these bricks might have been fitted together. Another clay brick, inscribed with Nebuchadnezzar's name.
Now, the interesting thing as well is around here on the edge, because here you can see nice and thick layering of this thing called bitumen.
Now that looks just like tar or something.
Well, that's essentially what it is. It's a petroleum liquid which solidifies. And really what we have here is the Babylonian equivalent of cement. This would have held all the bricks together.
So you've got the brick and also mortar.
Absolutely, but there's more to it than that, because this is actually waterproof. If you know your Old Testament, for example, Noah is told that when he builds his ark, he must line the hull of the ark in bitumen. Why? To make it waterproof.
So it was possible for the Babylonians to create a waterproof structure. Experts believe its most likely position was right by the Ishtar Gate. But in the arid heat of Babylon, such a garden would need constant tending. The river Euphrates runs through Babylon, but if the gardens were elevated, the water would have to be raised from the river somehow. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, a counterbalanced lever was used called the shaduf. Some research also suggests that the Babylonians had a screw-like system to raise water. To understand what sort of plants may have been grown in the garden, Tessa visits one of the leading centers of botanical studies, Kew Gardens in England, where she meets expert Jules Hayward.
Jules, I'm absolutely staggered. This is so much more lush and verdant than I imagined. Were these the kind of plants that would have been in the hanging garden?
Well, we believe that this is exactly the sort of stuff, this tropical foliage, as opposed to the indigenous cacti, which there would have been in the gardens, but much more of this tropical effect, because these were, in the end, pleasure gardens.
Of all the 7 wonders, this is the hardest to recreate.
I think looking at the evidence, the bricks, the bitumen and so on, the Babylonians clearly had the technology to build the gardens. But with no archaeological evidence, to get a sense of what they actually looked like, we have to go back to the Greek historians. And the best description is Strabo's. He actually talks of arched vaults, of terraced roofs, stairways and screws on the stairs that conducted water. It's not a lot, but the Greek historians were particularly scientific in the way they gathered their information, so I tend to go with them.
Using these written accounts, along with evidence recovered from Babylon, it's possible to build an image of what the gardens might have looked like. Supported terraced roofs built of clay bricks lined with bitumen. Ingenious technology keeping exotic plants flourishing in the desert heat. The Babylonians, familiar with pleasure gardens, might have found them commonplace, but to Greek observers, they were one of the wonders of the world. 23 centuries ago, a Greek island was home to a piece of engineering that, even by today's standards, was extraordinary. It was the biggest statue in the known world, the Colossus. Rhodes lies in the Mediterranean, 10 miles off the coast of Turkey. The Colossus stood in its capital, also called Rhodes. Our investigator, Mark Telesnik, has come here armed with the accounts of the ancient writers to form a picture of how the statue was built.
We're here in Rhodes in order to try to flesh out the Colossus of Rhodes. The limited data is sketchy, and it's based all on quite ancient literature. We're told that it's about 31 meters high. We're told that it's made of bronze with an internal skeleton of stone and iron. We were told that a finger of the statue was about the size of a man. The big question then is, can we use any of this data in order to try to learn something about Colossus of Rhodes? We don't know where he stood. We don't know what he looked like.
Local expert Dr. Manolis Stefanakis is a classical archaeologist. He tells Mark that the Colossus was built by the islanders in celebration of a great victory.
Colossus was built by a local sculptor called Charis. The Rhodians decided to build this statue after the successful defense of the Rhodians against the Macedonian army.
So the statue was built in celebration of the successful defense of the city after 305, when the siege began. And it was built when?
He started on the statue in the year 292 and took 12 years to be finished. So it was actually delivered in 280 BCE.
The Colossus was an image of Helios, the sun god and the island's protector. The Rhodians believed that Helios had made their island the most beautiful in the world. In return, they offered gratitude and fervent worship. Ancient sources tell us that the Colossus was built using iron bars. They say it was weighted with stone. Mark believes that the Colossus's method of construction and its size may have decided how the statue stood.
What would he have looked like? What would his pose have been?
One representation is Helios waving with one hand and having a drape in his other hand.
Waving is going to be difficult because in order for someone to wave, the stresses, especially here on the structure, would be huge. They would need some sort of strut.
Exactly.
To hold it up there, and I think that would be ugly.
That wouldn't look nice.
Okay. So I think we can scrap the possibility of the waving arm.
However, If the Colossus's hand was fixed to his forehead, shielding his eyes, it would give greater stability.
What was the reason for the drape or the bow?
As a third leg,
Okay.
give him stability.
The technique of sculpting a robe to give a statue extra support at its base is well documented. It would have made the enormous structure of the Colossus much stronger. The exterior is said to have been made entirely of bronze. Manolis takes Mark to a bronze casting pit, or kiln, which dates back to the time of the Colossus. It's proof that the technology to build the statue did exist here.
We have, in this specific area, 7 kilns of this type. So we know that this is the neighborhood of the bronzesmiths.
This is very important because we're saying that Colossus was cast from bronze. How big of a statue could be done here?
Well, the maximum height of a statue built in this kiln would be about 10 meters.
Sections of bronze, up to 5 feet in length, could be cast in this pit, then fixed together to create a statue over 30 feet high. The Colossus was cast in parts too, with bronze sheets fastened onto the statue's internal skeleton. This jointed design gave it flexibility. It meant that it could withstand high winds.
How big of a kiln would we need to do Colossus?
Well, I think we are looking for a kiln at least 3 times the size of this one.
Have you found anything like that yet?
No, we didn't have any luck so far.
Marx found out what the Colossus looked like, and it's clear that the Rhodians had the technology to build it. But this doesn't help him to pin down the location of the Colossus. Traditional depictions of the statue, like this 16th century engraving, show the Colossus straddling the harbor, allowing ships to pass between his legs. But there's a problem with this. Accounts say that construction took 12 years. If it happened here, it would have necessitated the closure of the harbor. And yet this harbor was of vital strategic importance to the islanders. The statue builders lived in a time of war. They constructed Colossus following an important victory, a narrow escape after a heavy naval siege. It makes no sense that they would celebrate by compromising their defenses.
So based on the discussions we've had now, the whole idea of the Colossus being astride the harbor, at least at this point in time, we can cross that one off the list?
It's totally fictitious. Okay. It comes from medieval romanticism, basically.
When we pair this argument with the ancient sources, which say that when the statue fell, it fell on land, it becomes clear. The traditional image of the Colossus standing astride the harbor seems to be nothing more than a Renaissance fantasy. Some archaeologists believe it may have stood on the site now occupied by the fortress of St. Nicholas. The fortress dates from the 15th century, but some of its stone may have come from the time of the Colossus.
What are the pros and cons for Colossus being constructed, let's say, close by in this area?
To be honest, I don't see any pros in this theory. The improbability of having such a huge statue at the entrance of the military port. If you want my opinion, I would never build a statue like that here. I would look for another place, maybe somewhere inland, maybe higher, so it would be visible by everybody.
Looking back at the town, it makes sense for the Colossus to be up on the hill where it could be seen from a greater distance. Walking up to this higher ground reveals a clue. Underneath what used to be a school, remains of more ancient buildings have been found. One of those buildings was a temple to Helios.
So this is the highest spot, downtown Rhodes, some 20 meters above sea level in antiquity. Now, from this spot, we have very important finds. First of all, a marble head of Helios, and an important inscription listing the names of the annual priests of Helios.
And what would that tell us?
That could tell us that we're probably standing on the area of the temple of Helios.
Helios was the Rhodians' most important deity. It's believed that this whole area may have been dedicated to his worship. And within what were once the grounds of the temple, now stands the Palace of Grand Masters. It was built in medieval times by the Knights of St. John. It makes sense that the Colossus would stand within the grounds of Helios' temple. And from here, it would have looked down on this island's 3 most important harbors.
So we're standing now at the highest point in the walled city, overlooking 3 of the ports?
Yes, if Colossus stood here, he would overlook the commercial and the secondary harbor from this side. And if you come around, he would also overlook the military harbor.
Okay.
Besides, we know that when he fell among housing. And this area next to the palace has been one of the most densely populated areas since that time.
Falling here, the Colossus would have flattened housing. It suggests that this was the site of the statue.
Well, this is it. This is the spot where we thought Colossus stood at.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just trying to imagine. It's going to be about 2 times higher than the top of the palace, right?
At least.
It was a huge operation. This was not one man building Colossus. They must have had an army of men working on it. At the time, people believed in the gods, so to see something like this towering over you must have been somewhat frightening even.
The Rhodians built this statue to honor their god. Across the sea, in what is now mainland Turkey, one man would demand 400 statues, all to honor himself. He was King Mausolus, and they would adorn the first and grandest mausoleum. The once great city of Halicarnassus is now the small town of Bodrum in southwest Turkey. In the 4th century BC, Halicarnassus was the capital of Caria, part of the Persian Empire, and home to the region's ruler, King Mausolus. In the hope of creating a dynasty and to keep the royal line intact, he married his sister, Artemisia. Legend has it that around 350 BC, she built a tomb, the mausoleum, to honor his memory.
What I find very surprising about the mausoleum of Halicarnassus is that it wasn't built in dedication of any of the historical greats of that early period. Not dedicated to the Persian warrior King Xerxes, for example, not in honor of Alexander the Great, but in fact it was built for a pretty minor provincial ruler. Yes, a successful one, but King Mausolus, not many people have heard of him. So to have made it onto the list of the 7 ancient wonders, there must have been something truly magnificent about the structure itself.
No ancient images of the mausoleum have survived. Again, the most influential depiction comes from the Renaissance artist Martin van Heemskerk. Does it bear any resemblance to the reality? Our investigator, Tessa Dunlop, meets again with Dr. Julian Bennett, an archaeologist who spent years trying to piece together the story of King Mausolus.
Why was this vast mausoleum constructed?
That's a very good question. We don't know, quite honestly. He certainly was well known for taxing the population around here. He built up an enormous amount of wealth. So one presumes it was just really for show, to how wealthy he was.
Thanks to excavation work in the 19th century, we know exactly where the mausoleum stood. Tessa and Julian will try to piece it back together by combining the physical evidence with historical accounts. Pliny gives dimensions of the mausoleum that have been confirmed by archaeology. It was 120 feet long and 100 feet wide, covering the whole of this excavated area. The base of the structure was built from a distinctive type of stone, green limestone.
Actually being within the structure gives you a sense of its vastness, doesn't it?
Yes, it really was a substantial structure, all founded on these massive sort of green limestone blocks.
OK, so this would have been foot level, foundations?
This would actually be below the ground level, the proper ground level. So there'd be another sort of 4 or 5 levels of the same blocks on top of this.
King Mausolus's resting place was a subterranean burial chamber under this limestone base.
And here we have the burial chamber. And in here, this is where the sarcophagus would have been.
So this is where Mausolus was actually buried, in here?
Pliny tells us that the tomb was 140 feet tall, around twice the height of this minaret tower. So it's clear that most of the stones that made up the mausoleum have gone, probably plundered. But that green limestone is so distinctive. Archaeologists have been able to trace stones to other buildings around Bodrum. One of them is a 15th century castle.
Wherever you look around the whole castle, this is what you see. We use green limestone.
And that's what I'm looking for, is that when I'm trying to identify which bits come from the mausoleum, it's the limestone and the marble.
Limestone and the marble, you've got this one really white marble with Parian marble, and that is very distinguishable.
So many of the slabs have been incorporated into the castle that experts have reached a surprising conclusion. The bulk of the mausoleum structure must have been solid, with no internal spaces. Pliny also tells us that on top of the podium was a colonnade of 36 columns, each nearly 10 feet apart. A stepped pyramid roof stood on top. But this in itself is not what made this monument a wonder of the world. Pliny writes of a building adorned with fabulous statues and reliefs. On this site, only fragments of statues have ever been found. A 16th century account describes stonework and statues being broken up and fed into kilns. They would make lime for the mortar which held the stones of Bodrum Castle together. Two great statues have been reassembled, however. Replicas of them stand by the castle gates.
So here we have copies of two of the statues from the mausoleum. This is the statue that many people think is Mausolus himself, and a statue of a woman who many people believe is Artemisia.
Knowing the size of these statues and the dimensions of the mausoleum, some experts have estimated that up to 400 figures ringed its walls. According to Pliny, a magnificent four-horse chariot stood on top. Remains found in the rubble of the site give just a glimpse of its former glory.
This was a four-horse chariot. That was all made of marble with metal fittings for the horse harness and so forth. But what nobody knows is whether there was anybody in the chariot. This is the big question.
Putting together the physical evidence with the words of the ancient authors, we can now build up a convincing picture of what the mausoleum of Halicarnassus may have looked like. It was an immense three-tiered structure consisting of podium, colonnade, and roof. Clad in brilliant marble, it dominated the landscape. Friezes and around 400 freestanding statues stood on every surface. And on top, a four-horse chariot. Such was the majesty of King Mausolus's tomb, the word mausoleum entered our language for good. Of the 7 wonders listed by Greek scholars in the 3rd century BC, only one stood on mainland Greece, a status symbol that put it on a par with the great civilizations of the past. Over 40 feet tall and made from gold and ivory, it was a statue of the king of the gods, Zeus. To discover what evidence remains of this statue, Mark Telesnik has traveled to Olympia on the Peloponnesian Peninsula in the southwest of Greece. Olympia today is full of ruins and remains, testaments to the importance of this place to the ancients.
The most obvious thing is the amount, the quality, and the quantity of the physical evidence of the entire area. But on the other side of the coin, we're here to check out the statue within the Temple of Zeus. And there we're completely in the dark. We don't have any physical evidence, and we're gonna have to do some serious investigation and try to figure out how to flesh out the statue.
Mark has enlisted the help of Judy Berenger, a doctor of archaeology. Judy is an authority on Olympia. It was the site of the ancient Olympic Games, which began in 776 BC. And it had enormous cultural importance. And the games were held in honor of Zeus.
The games, like all of these athletic games, were not just athletic events, but were given or made in honor of a god. And here it was the god Zeus. So we're in a religious sanctuary. We're not just at an athletic place.
The statue was housed in the Temple of Zeus. The temple was built in 456 BC and destroyed by an earthquake in the 5th century AD. The remains of the enormous external columns reveal how the temple exterior might have looked.
Oh, wow. That is good.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns parallel to one another that have toppled over.
The drums laid out like dominoes.
Right.
And then we can see the capitals at the end.
Greek historian Pausanias put the temple at over 60 feet tall, and Mark's calculations confirm this. By measuring the spaces between the exterior columns on each side, we know that the length of the temple was 220 feet, and there were more columns inside.
Okay, so this is the reason why we're here.
Exactly. This is the wonder. This is the reason for the temple's existence, is to house a cult statue.
Mark still needs to know what the statue looked like. There's very little to go on except contemporary accounts. One ancient author puts the height of the statue at 40 feet, and Strabo added that if Zeus moved to stand up, he would unroof the temple. These accounts are in keeping with Mark's calculations from the height of the columns. They also tell us who built the statue. A sculptor called Phidias had already claimed his place in history, creating another statue at the Acropolis in Athens. We also know where he built the statue, thanks to an extraordinary find. A cup inscribed with Phidias's name. It's evidence that this, the location of the find, was his workshop. The size and proportions of Phidias's workshop were identical to the space the statue was intended to occupy.
When the statue was made and put in place 20 years after the temple was made, it had to work. It had to be perfect because everything was so perfect about the temple itself, you couldn't take that statue in if you didn't know it was going to work.
Marx noticed something else about the workshop. It seems to have the same orientation as the temple. To find out if this was deliberate, he takes a couple of readings.
Okay, so try to take a bearing off this wall.
I read about 79 degrees here.
That's bang, wow. Okay, I'm reading a tad below 80 degrees, something like that.
The results are astonishing. The workshop and temple are aligned precisely.
The differences we got were so minute that it couldn't be left to chance.
Mark believes that to have gone to so much trouble to recreate the conditions of the temple, sunlight must have played a big part in Phidias's design. But he still needs to know how Zeus was constructed. We know that the statue of Zeus was not made from stone, but its skin fashioned from ivory and his robes and sandals from gold. At the time, only Phidias was creating statues from these materials, and the craftsmanship they required was masterful. These molds found in his workshop may have been used to cast the gold robes. And found alongside the molds were these, small chips of ivory.
I'd like to try to get a feel for how they might have tried to make the ivory skin. How are they going to get sheets of ivory out of the elephant tusk?
You would shave it off in layers, much as you might do sharpening a pencil, so it's coming off in a layer.
How would they be softened? Because I know the elephant tusk is quite hard.
The speculation is that the Greeks soaked the ivory in vinegar for some period of time until it becomes malleable.
Once they had the softened piece of ivory, they could put it in a mold.
That's right. The ivory would take the shape of the mold, where then it would dry and presumably retain the shape of the mold.
But even the largest elephant tusk would only yield a relatively small piece of ivory. And the statue of Zeus was colossal, over 40 feet tall.
What's going to give this entire jigsaw puzzle, what's put together, some structural stability?
We know, by analogy with Phidias's earlier creation, the statue of Athena Parthenos and the Parthenon, also this colossus of ivory and gold, we know that it was held up by a wooden and perhaps metal armature, and so we can assume the same was true for the later Phidian Zeus. They would have used painted plaster, white painted plaster on the exterior to imitate marble. And we actually have some plaster remaining here on the surface. You can see a good piece of it right here.
This plaster may look dull and yellow now, but when the temple was built, it would have been a brilliant white, reflecting the light and making the columns radiant. And Phidias had another trick up his sleeve. With the only source of natural light in the temple, the one huge door, he designed a feature to make the most of this light. Standing directly in front of the statue was a reflecting pool, and 2,500 years later, we can still see the evidence.
If you run your fingers alongside of this, you can feel a channel here.
Yeah.
And you can trace that line not only on this side, but on the opposite side as well, at exactly the same point. And this seems to mark a water line, where water or liquid was.
The dramatic reflections created by the pool were coupled with the opulence of the ivory and gold that made up the body of Zeus. Surrounded by the brilliant white columns of the temple, it would have made an awe-inspiring sight. In Zeus's hands, he held a scepter as an emblem of his power, and a winged figure of Nike, or victory. Lit by torches and fires, the temple would have been a spectacular sight.
We certainly do see incredibly ornate structure and statues that make up the temple itself. Everything made the temple so beautiful, and yet the temple is not what we're here for. It was the statue of Zeus. So the size and the dimensions of the statue compared to the size and beauty and dimensions of the building must have been incredibly beautiful in order to make that one of the seven wonders and not the temple and that together.
The seven wonders, a testament to man's engineering skill, his overreaching ambition. All but the pyramid are gone. But even this has been stripped, its limestone casing plundered to build Cairo. And yet none of these projects was a failure. What they left behind may offer us a lesson in the danger of pride, but they also create a shining example, proof that ambition, aspiration, and vision can create something legendary.